Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Snoozy Scientist. I'm really glad you made it here tonight. Wherever you're watching from, maybe wrapped in a blanket, resting on the couch, or lying beneath a quiet sky full of stars, I'm grateful you're here, spending a piece of your time with me. Tonight, we're going back, way, way back, not thousands of years, but millions of years, to a time before humans existed, when fragile apes clung to survival on an unforgiving earth, a world of shifting climates, prowling predators, and landscapes that offered no mercy. In those days, nature didn't care who was clever, only who lived long enough to see another dawn. 7 million years ago, our story began, not as humans but as creatures slowly reshaped by time, chance, and change. Our evolution has been anything but gentle, bodies bent and broken by shifting climates, minds stretched by firelight and stone tools, generations tested again and again. Nature is brutally unforgiving, and in such a world, even survival itself wasn't enough. Only those who adapted could continue the story. 99% of every species that has ever lived has gone extinct. Entire dynasties of creatures, far stronger and more fearsome than us, came and went, but we remain. At least 20 distinct human species once walked this planet, each with its own hopes of survival. But today, not a single one remains, except us, and even our own lineage nearly disappeared. Genetic evidence tells us that at certain points in our history, we came terrifyingly close to vanishing forever, with humanity reduced to only a few thousand individuals clinging to survival. And yet, somehow, against impossible odds, we are here. Every human alive today is proof that the chain never broke. Each heartbeat you feel is linked to an unbroken line stretching across 7 million years. So how did we get here? At what point did ordinary apes, vulnerable and small, transform into the only species capable of questioning its own existence? And how close did we come to never making it at all? Tonight, we'll walk through the 7 million years of evolution that shaped us. We'll meet the ancestors who first stood upright, the ones who learned fire, the ones who painted on cave walls, and we'll see how every adaptation, every leap forward, carved us into who we are today. Before we begin, if you enjoy drifting off with science stories with no pressure to stay awake, then a like and a subscribe would mean the world to me. It helps this channel grow and helps others like you find their way here. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you winding down from tonight, and what time is it there? I love seeing how far across the world these soft explorations travel. So now, take a slow breath, let your shoulders soften, and together, let's quietly step back 7 million years and see how we became human. To truly understand how we became who we are, we have to begin at the very root of our family tree. Long before we painted caves or shaped stone into blades, long before fire warmed our nights or villages tied us to the land, there was a single turning point, a quiet divide in deep time that set us on a path away from every other living creature. That moment was the split from our closest relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos. Scientists believe this separation began around 7 million years ago, when a population of ancient apes found themselves shaped by changing landscapes, shifting climates, and pressures that would slowly carve them into something new. The Earth of that time looked nothing like the world we know. Vast tropical forests that had stretched across Africa began to thin as the climate shifted. What was once an endless canopy of trees was being broken apart by spreading grasslands, patches of woodland, and open savannas. For creatures adapted to climbing, swinging, and foraging in the safety of trees, this change was a threat as well as an opportunity. Staying high among the branches meant dwindling food sources and shrinking homes. Venturing down to the ground meant stepping into danger, where predators like giant cats waited patiently in the shadows. It was in this unstable, unforgiving world that one of our earliest known ancestors appeared. The species is called Sahelanthropus chidensis, discovered in the desert sands of Chad. The fossils are more than 7 million years old, making them some of the oldest evidence we have of the moment when the human journey truly began. The skull of Sahelanthropus is small, only about the size of a modern chimpanzee, yet there are hints within its shape that tell a different story. The opening where the spine connects to the skull is shifted slightly forward, suggesting that this creature may have walked upright at least some of the time. It was not yet human, but it was no longer fully ape either. It stood at the fragile crossroads of what we once were and what we would one day become. Imagine the world through its eyes. The safety of the canopy was gone, and survival meant learning to move across the dangerous ground. Walking upright, even in short bursts, could have been a way to see over tall grass, to spot approaching predators before it was too late. Standing tall also freed the hands to carry food or perhaps to hold the young close while moving quickly between sheltering trees. These were small advantages, but in a world where survival was measured in inches and seconds, small advantages mattered. Life was not gentle for Sahelanthropus. The landscapes of ancient Africa were harsh, filled with long dry seasons, sudden storms, and constant shifts between abundance and scarcity. Water holes dried up, forests turned to grasslands, and grasslands sometimes withered into near desert. For a fragile population of primates, every day was uncertain. Food sources were unpredictable, predators were everywhere, and the line between life and death was as thin as a blade of grass. Yet out of these hardships came the first step in a journey that would stretch across millions of years. This was the beginning of a story that would see bodies slowly reshaped by evolution, hips and spines adjusting to carry weight in a new way, hands becoming freer, more dexterous, more capable of grasping objects with precision, eyes and brains gradually tuned not only to the present moment of survival, but to planning, remembering, and imagining. None of these changes were quick. They unfolded over hundreds of thousands of generations, shaped by chance, by environment, and by the constant pressure of survival. For Sahelanthropus, there was no awareness of what it represented. It was simply another creature trying to endure the shifting world around it. But looking back now, we can see that these early beings were carrying the spark of something new. The simple act of occasionally standing on two legs, of freeing the hands from the ground, was the fragile beginning of everything that would follow. Without that first uncertain step, there would have been no tools, no firelight, no art, no language, and no humans to tell the story. As the forests continued to shrink and the grasslands spread wider, other early ancestors would follow, each one carrying the experiment forward. The split from the chimpanzees had begun the long, winding path that led to us, and though Sahelanthropus would not live to see what came of it, the marks of that beginning are written deep in our bones today. The journey that started in the shifting landscapes of ancient Africa did not stop there. It pressed forward, one generation after another, until standing tall was no longer an occasional advantage, but a defining trait. But from that point onward, the human story would take on a momentum that could not be undone. Once our ancestors began to drift from the safety of the trees, the ground beneath them demanded new ways of moving. For millions of years, apes had relied on strong arms to swing branch to branch, their backs arched for climbing, their hands shaped for gripping bark and fruit. But as forests shrank and open landscapes spread across Africa, those same bodies had to adapt. Moving on all fours across the ground left them vulnerable, unable to see far across the grasslands, unable to carry much as they fled from danger or searched for food. Slowly, a new way of walking began to emerge, one that would define our species before anything else. Our ancestors began to stand upright. The shift to bipedalism, walking on two legs, was not a sudden leap, but a gradual reshaping of bone and muscle over countless generations. Early hips tilted differently, balancing weight in ways that freed the hands from touching the ground. The curve of the spine slowly changed, creating an S shape better suited for upright balance. Knees locked more firmly into place so that each step carried weight more efficiently. At first, these changes may have seemed small, but together they created something extraordinary. For the first time, an ape could walk tall. Standing upright gave enormous advantages in a dangerous, unpredictable world. From the height of two legs, our ancestors could see further across the savanna. Rising above tall grasses meant spotting predators earlier, noticing a lion waiting in silence or a pack of wild dogs hunting nearby. It also meant seeing opportunities in the distance, such as fruiting trees, herds of animals, or safe places to rest. Height gave awareness, and awareness often meant survival. But vision was only part of the gift. With their hands no longer bound to the ground, our ancestors could carry food over long distances. They could bring fruit back to share with their group, or transport scavenged meat to a safer place to eat. Mothers could hold their infants close to their chests while still moving quickly when danger struck. Upright posture turned the hands into tools of survival, not just instruments for climbing. Those freed hands would, in time, hold sticks, stones, and eventually tools shaped with intent. They would stroke the fur of a child, carry water from a stream, or wave signals across the open plains. The simple act of balancing on 2 feet unlocked a future that no other ape could follow. While other species remained bound to the trees or to the ground on all fours, our ancestors were stepping into an entirely new world. Of course, walking upright was not without its costs. Evolution rarely gives gifts without asking for something in return. Our spines, once well adapted for horizontal bodies, now carried weight in ways that often strained the lower back. To this day, many of us know the ache of that evolutionary compromise. Our knees and hips also bear the burden, wearing down under the constant pressure of standing tall. Yet perhaps the greatest cost of bipedalism fell upon childbirth. As hips narrowed to allow efficient walking, the passage for giving birth became more difficult. At the same time, our ancestors' brains were beginning to grow larger, and with them, the skulls of infants. This meant childbirth became one of the most dangerous moments in a mother's life. Many did not survive, and many infants were lost in the struggle of being born. But those who did survive carried forward the lineage, and with them the possibility of what humans would one day become. Despite the pain and risks, upright posture endured because its benefits outweighed the dangers. It allowed survival in new environments, carrying both food and children across long distances, and offered the constant advantage of sight. It was more than a new way of moving, it was the beginning of a new relationship with the world. No longer confined to the canopy or crawling across the earth, our ancestors stood face to face with the horizon. This change set them on a path that no other ape would take. Standing tall was the first step toward tools, fire, language, and imagination. It was a doorway into possibility, and once crossed, it could never be closed. As generations passed and bodies continued to change, the hands that were freed would soon begin to shape not just how our ancestors survived, but how they dreamed, created, and built the world around them. Once our ancestors began walking upright, something remarkable happened. Their hands, no longer pressed to the ground for support, were free in a way no other animal's hands had ever been. And those hands would slowly become one of the most powerful tools in the entire history of life on Earth. They were not claws for slashing or hooves for pounding. They were not wings for flying or fins for swimming. They were something entirely different. They were instruments of creation, of destruction, and eventually of imagination. The changes were subtle at first. Evolution does not make sweeping transformations overnight. Over countless generations, the bones of the hand began to shift, the muscles and tendons reshaped, and the thumb became more opposable. This opposable thumb, able to press firmly against the fingers, created grips unlike anything seen before. With it came the ability to pinch, hold, twist, and shape objects with precision. While other primates can grasp, none can do it with the same degree of fine control as humans. This seemingly small change would open doors that no claw or tooth could ever match. Imagine an ancestor plucking fruit from a tree. Instead of tearing clumsily, they could twist and pull with care, preserving food for later. Imagine holding a stick not just to wave or drag, but to strike with purpose, or to dig in the soil, or to pry open a hidden nest of insects. The hand became a lever of survival, adapting to each new challenge. Even before the first stone was chipped into a tool, those hands were already tools themselves. The human hand is unique in more ways than one. Our fingers are longer and more slender compared to apes, giving greater reach and flexibility. The tips of our fingers are sensitive, packed with nerves that allow us to feel texture, temperature, and even the slightest vibration. The palm is broad, creating both strength and balance. When combined with the thumb's full rotation, these traits gave our ancestors extraordinary dexterity. They could grip an object tightly for power or hold it delicately for detail. Over time, different kinds of grips developed. The power grip, where an object is clutched firmly in the palm with the thumb wrapped around, made it possible to throw stones, wield branches, or later swing a hammering tool. The precision grip, where the thumb and fingertips meet delicately, allowed for tasks that required control, such as stripping leaves, peeling bark, or eventually carving shapes from stone. These two grips, working together, gave our ancestors abilities no other creature possessed. They could act with both strength and subtlety, with force and with finesse. The ability to throw accurately is another trait that set us apart. A well-aimed stone or spear could change the balance of power between prey and predator. It extended reach far beyond the length of an arm, allowing our ancestors to strike from a distance. This was not only a survival advantage, it was also a spark of foresight. To throw is to anticipate, to aim at where something will be rather than where it is. The hand, in this way, became connected to the growing mind, each shaping the other across time. But the hands were not only for survival, they were for expression. With fingers free and nimble, gestures became more elaborate. A wave of the hand could signal danger. A raised palm could calm or command. These early signs would one day flow into full language, where the movement of hands carried meaning just as words would. Later, those same hands would trace images on cave walls, dip into pigments, and leave behind marks of imagination that outlasted their makers. Think of the journey contained in those hands. Once, they were survival claws, gripping branches for safety. Over ages, they became the carriers of food, the holders of fire, the shapers of stone. Much later, they would guide the delicate edge of a paintbrush, carve symbols into clay, and glide across strings to make music. The same anatomy that once clenched a branch in desperation would one day hold a pen, a violin bow, or a chisel carving marble. It is a line unbroken, a single thread weaving through millions of years of change. The emotional power of this transformation is profound. Every time we hold a tool, or reach out to touch another person, or write a word, we are reenacting the legacy of our ancestors' first steps into dexterity. Our hands are not just flesh and bone, they are history, written into form and function, carrying within them the memory of every adaptation that allowed us to move forward. From survival to art, from power to precision, they carry the story of what made us human. And as these hands continued to evolve and refine, they were preparing for a revolution even greater. The first sparks of technology were waiting, ready to leap from palm to stone, from imagination to action. The future of humanity would be shaped in those hands, one strike at a time. With hands that were now freed and capable of extraordinary precision, our ancestors began to do something that no other creature had ever done before. They looked at the world around them and saw not only what was, but what could be. A simple stone was no longer just part of the ground. In the right hands, with the right strike, it could be transformed into something entirely new. This was the dawn of technology, and it began with a species scientists call Homo habilis, which means handy man. Living around 2.5 million years ago, Homo habilis walked a world that was harsh and uncertain. Predators were larger and stronger, food was scarce and often hard to reach. Survival depended not only on strength or speed, but on creativity. And in the clever hands of Homo habilis, the first stone flakes were born. Imagine the scene. An ancestor crouches by a riverbank, a round stone heavy in their palm. They raise another rock and bring it down sharply, splitting a fragment loose. The flake, though small, is sharp enough to cut into meat, scrape bark, or shape wood. For the first time, an object was not just used as it was found, it was changed, altered with purpose, given a new identity. That single spark of imagination separated our ancestors from every other creature alive. These early tools were simple, yet they opened doors to survival that had been closed before. A sharpened edge could slice through animal hides, making it easier to reach the nourishing meat within. It could scrape marrow from bones, unlocking calories rich with energy that bare teeth could never reach. With flakes in hand, plants could be processed more efficiently, fibers stripped, and branches shaped into digging sticks. Every strike of stone against stone carved out not just a tool, but a step forward in the story of evolution. What made this moment so important was not only the tool itself, but the thinking behind it. Breaking stone with intent required foresight. It meant recognizing that a rock could become more than a rock. It meant planning, seeing the usefulness of an object, not for what it was, but for what it might become. This was a revolution of the mind. The brains of Homo habilis were not as large as those of later humans, but they carried the seed of imagination that would one day grow into science, art, and invention. Hold a sharp stone flake in your thoughts for a moment. Its edge gleams in the sunlight, jagged and dangerous, yet held with purpose. In that shard is the future of knives, of chisels, of scalpels, of every instrument ever forged by human hands. That cutting edge was more than a tool for survival. It was the beginning of humanity's partnership with technology. The act of creating tools also shaped the body in return. The muscles of the hand grew stronger, the coordination between eyes and fingers more refined. Each generation that practiced tool making passed on small advantages, selecting for minds that could problem solve, for hands that could strike with accuracy, for the patience to shape stone again and again until it broke just right. Evolution and invention were weaving together into a single thread. There is something deeply emotional in imagining that first spark. To strike one stone against another is such a simple gesture, yet from it flowed the entire cascade of human history. With that first flake, the boundaries between what was found and what was made began to blur. The world became not just a place to live in, but a canvas to shape. Sharp rocks cut into the future, leaving behind a trail of possibilities that would only grow. Every chipped fragment left on the ground was more than discarded stone. It was a message across time, telling us that here, on this spot, someone once imagined differently. Someone looked at a problem and answered it with creation. That answer echoed forward, carried in the calloused hands of our ancestors, in the growing weight of their brains, and in the survival of their children. And as those first sparks of technology spread, life itself began to change. The hands that once held simple flakes were preparing for even greater mastery. Fire waited in the distance, unseen but inevitable, ready to transform night into day and weakness into strength. But before the fire came, there were stones, and in the hands of Homo habilis, those stones carved open the very path to becoming human. Long before humans lit candles in windows or built cities that glowed against the night, there was a moment when our ancestors learned to hold the most dangerous force in nature in their hands. Fire had always been there, blazing across dry grasslands after a lightning strike, spilling from the heart of volcanoes or crackling through forests in storms. For millions of years, it was a thing to fear, a wall of heat and destruction that could not be controlled. But at some point, a group of ancient humans began to look at those flames differently. Instead of only running from it, they carried it, fed it, and learned to keep it alive. That moment changed everything. The species most often credited with this extraordinary leap is Homo erectus, which appeared nearly 2 million years ago. They were taller and more robust than their ancestors, with bodies shaped for long-distance travel across open landscapes. Their brains were larger than those of Homo habilis, but still smaller than our own. Yet what set them apart was not just their bodies or their brains, but their relationship with fire. Evidence suggests that Homo erectus may have been the first to control it, gathering burning branches from natural blazes and keeping them smoldering for days. Over time, they learned how to nurture flames with dry wood, to protect them from wind and rain, and eventually to create fire when it was needed. To picture the impact of this, imagine a dark night on the savannah. For earlier hominins, nightfall was a time of terror. The tall grasses came alive with prowling shapes, eyes glowing in the moonlight, teeth glinting in silence. To sleep was to risk being stalked, but with fire, the darkness changed. Flames pushed back the shadows. Predators hesitated at the edge of the light, unwilling to cross the line of heat and smoke. What had once been fear became safety. A circle of fire was a circle of protection. The benefits went beyond safety. Fire transformed food. Raw meat and plants that were tough to chew or difficult to digest could now be softened and cooked. This released far more energy than raw diets ever could. A single cooked meal delivered calories that fueled the body more efficiently, and this surplus of energy supported the growth of larger brains. Over countless generations, this extra nutrition helped Homo erectus develop the mental capacity for planning, cooperation, and more complex tools. In this way, fire did not just warm their bodies, it fueled their minds. Cooked food also saved time. Without fire, chewing raw plants and uncooked meat could take hours each day. With fire, meals became easier to eat, leaving more time for exploration, social bonding, and learning. Around shared flames, groups of Homo erectus likely huddled together, not only eating but also communicating, gesturing, and passing knowledge from one to another. The firelight became a classroom and a gathering place, a rare moment of stillness in a life that was otherwise constant motion. There was another gift hidden in the flames, fire-hardened wooden spears, making them stronger for hunting. It kept insects away, reduced disease by killing parasites in cooked food, and warmed the body on cold nights. It allowed travel into colder regions, places that would have been impossible to endure without its heat. In this way, Fire extended the range of our ancestors, letting them step into new environments with a sense of control. The emotional weight of this change is profound. Imagine the awe of those first humans watching sparks catch dry grass, the heat flaring bright in their faces. For the first time, they were not simply at the mercy of nature. They had bent it, held it, and turned it into something that answered their needs. The fire that had once burned their homes and frightened them into hiding was now a companion, alive but tamed, dangerous yet faithful. Every flicker of flame carried meaning. It meant warmth when the night grew cold, protection when predators circled, and light when darkness pressed in. It meant life itself could be a little safer, a little longer, a little more certain. What began as a fragile ember carried from a lightning strike would grow into a bond so deep that even now, thousands of millennia later, we still gather around fires, candles, and glowing screens, finding comfort in their light. And as the flames burned on, they prepared the way for the next steps of the human journey. With fire secured, the night no longer belonged to predators. It belonged to us. The sparks that once leapt from stone to kindling were the same sparks that would one day ignite imagination, story, and invention. The future was glowing in the firelight, with fire at their side and tools in their hands. Our ancestors were no longer bound to the same narrow corners of the earth. For countless generations, early humans had lived within the cradle of Africa, shaped by its forests, rivers, and wide grasslands. But there came a time when staying was no longer enough. Whether it was drought, shifting climates, dwindling food, or simply curiosity, a remarkable thing happened. A species that had never known the lands beyond began to walk out of Africa, step by step, into the unknown. This was Homo erectus, and their journey marked the first great exodus in human history. Imagine the courage it must have taken to leave familiar hunting grounds behind, to cross rivers that seemed endless, mountains that scraped the sky, and deserts where the horizon never ended. Every step away from home was a step into uncertainty. Behind them lay the land that had sustained their kind for millions of years. Ahead of them lay mystery, and still they walked. Archaeological evidence shows that Homo erectus began leaving Africa nearly 2 million years ago. Their footprints spread far into Asia and Europe, reaching places no human ancestor had ever set foot before. Fossils and tools have been discovered across vast stretches of land, from the plains of the Middle East to the islands of Southeast Asia, and even into the cold landscapes of Europe. They did not move all at once, nor in a single wave, but slowly, over countless generations, they expanded. Each new group pushed a little farther, adapted a little more, and carved out a life in places that had once seemed impossible. Why did they leave? The earth itself may have pushed them forward. Shifts in climate often dried African plains, forcing animals and the humans who followed them to seek greener lands. Herds migrated, and with them came hunters. But perhaps it was not only survival, perhaps it was curiosity, the same restless spark that later carried humans across oceans and into space. For Homo erectus, the world was no longer a closed circle. It had become a path stretching outward without end. Their bodies were built for the journey. Homo erectus stood taller and walked more efficiently than their ancestors. Their long legs and narrow hips made them capable of traveling great distances, covering ground mile after mile with endurance unmatched by other primates. Their mastery of fire allowed them to rest in places that would have been too dangerous before, warming themselves at night and keeping predators at bay. Their tools gave them the means to hunt in new environments and to process foods they had never eaten before. Step by step, These advantages turned distant lands into new homes. Picture them crossing into Asia, where dense forests replaced the savannas they had known. Imagine them entering Europe, where cold winds cut against their skin and winters demanded resilience and ingenuity. To survive in these unfamiliar places, Homo erectus adapted again and again. They learned to hunt new animals, to build shelters against the cold, to fashion clothing from hides, and to endure challenges no African savanna had ever prepared them for. Each adaptation carried them further, reshaping not only their lives, but their minds. The courage of this journey is difficult to overstate. Every river crossed meant leaving behind the known. Every mountain climbed meant venturing into landscapes no ancestor had seen. There was no guarantee of safety, no promise of return, yet still they walked. Their children grew up under unfamiliar skies, in lands where the constellations shone in patterns different from those of their birthplace. Generations passed, and Africa became memory, even as its echo lived in their bones. This first great exodus marked something more than migration. It was the beginning of humanity's long tradition of exploration. The same restless steps that carried Homo erectus into Asia and Europe would one day lead our species across frozen land bridges, across oceans, and eventually beyond the planet itself. It was the first proof that humans are not meant to stay still. We are wanderers, bound to curiosity as much as to survival. And so the world began to open, one uncertain step at a time. With fire to protect them, with tools in their hands, and with courage in their hearts, Homo erectus spread far beyond the cradle where the story had begun. Their footprints are still there, etched in stone and soil, silent reminders of the moment when humanity first learned to leave home. And as they walked into strange lands, enduring cold winds and foreign skies, they carried with them the same hands that had shaped stone, the same fire that had turned fear into safety, and the same restless drive that would keep pushing their descendants into new frontiers. As Homo erectus spread across new lands, something remarkable began to unfold inside their skulls. The brain, that soft and fragile organ hidden beneath bone, started to grow at a pace unlike anything seen before in the history of life. From creatures whose brains were no larger than a chimpanzee's, evolution began shaping minds with more folds, more connections, and more potential. This expansion did not happen overnight. It took hundreds of thousands of years, but each generation carried just a little more capacity for memory, for planning, for awareness. Slowly, thought itself began to deepen. By the time of Homo erectus, brains had nearly doubled in size compared to their earlier ancestors. With that increase came new possibilities. Bigger brains meant more advanced tools, more organized hunting, and greater cooperation within groups. They could imagine solutions before acting. They could picture how to chase an animal into a trap, and they could share that vision with others. The growing mind was no longer only reacting to the world. It was beginning to shape the world in return. But this growth carried costs, and those costs were heavy. A larger brain required enormous amounts of energy. Even today, the human brain makes up only about 2% of our body's weight, yet it consumes around 20% of our energy. For our ancestors, that meant every meal mattered more than ever. They needed food rich in calories, whether it was cooked meat, marrow from bones, or starchy plants. Without a steady supply of energy, these new brains could not sustain themselves. The hunger for knowledge was, quite literally, a hunger of the body. The expansion of the brain also changed the way children were born. Larger skulls meant that childbirth became far more dangerous. The human pelvis, already narrowed for efficient upright walking, now had to pass infants with growing heads. This made giving birth a risky and painful process, with many mothers and infants lost in the struggle. Yet those who survived carried forward the future of our species. And survival after birth brought new challenges. Human infants were not like the young of other animals. A foal can stand within hours of being born. A chimpanzee baby can cling to its mother's fur almost immediately. Human babies, by contrast, are helpless. Their brains are so large that they must be born earlier in development while still unfinished. They cannot walk, they cannot feed themselves, they cannot even hold up their own heads. This vulnerability meant that families and groups had to care for their young in ways other species did not. The long dependency of human children may seem like a weakness, but it was also an opportunity. It created a window of time where the brain could continue to grow and adapt outside the womb. Infants absorbed knowledge from the world around them, learning from parents, siblings, and the group. They listened, watched, and imitated. Every gesture, every sound, every shared moment became part of their mental growth. Childhood became not only a stage of survival, but a stage of learning, stretching far longer than in any other primate. This dependence also wove families closer together. Parents needed help raising children, and so cooperation deepened. Older siblings, grandparents, and others in the community all became part of the process of keeping infants alive. This web of care built stronger social bonds, and those bonds became another key to survival. With big brains came vulnerability, but from that vulnerability came the strength of connection. The emotional price of intelligence was real. Larger brains meant more fear, more awareness of danger, and more uncertainty. To know more of the world was to carry more of its weight, but it also meant more joy, more play, and more imagination. A child's laughter around the fire, the comfort of shared food, or the spark of discovery when a new tool worked for the first time, all of these were gifts of the expanding mind. Intelligence came with risks, but it also offered hope. For every moment of weakness, there was a chance for creativity to tip the scales back toward survival. And as these brains grew larger, they were preparing for something far greater than hunting or gathering. They were building the foundations for art, for language, for memory, and for story. The same skulls that once bent in fear at the sound of a predator would one day bend in thought beneath the weight of questions about existence itself. The story of brains that grew too big is not only about biology, it is about the fragile balance of vulnerability before strength, of helpless infants who force their families to bond more closely, and of hungry minds that reshape the course of evolution. From this point onward, the path of humanity would be carried not just in bone or muscle, but in thought itself, stretching outward with every generation, waiting for what came next. As our ancestors' brains grew larger and their children became more dependent, the earth itself began to shift beneath their feet. The planet was never a gentle home. It was alive with change, and the climate often swung from one extreme to another. Across millions of years, the rhythm of ice and warmth beat steadily, reshaping continents, rivers, and forests. For humans, this meant that life was never stable. They were born not in comfort, but in crisis, where every generation had to adapt or vanish. The ice ages were among the greatest challenges. Massive glaciers spread across large parts of the world, locking away water, lowering sea levels, and chilling the air with relentless cold. Entire regions became uninhabitable, forcing both animals and humans to move or die. Even in areas not buried under ice, the effects were severe. Dry winds swept across once fertile plains, and vegetation struggled to survive. Herds of animals migrated to find new grazing grounds, and the humans who depended on them had no choice but to follow. To stand still was to starve. Between the great freezes came long stretches of warming. Forests grew and spread again, only to wither once more when the next cold wave returned. These constant swings between abundance and scarcity made it impossible to settle for long. The world itself seemed to be pulling the ground away every time life became stable. In some places, drought stretched on for years, leaving rivers as cracked beds of dust. In others, floods swept through valleys, forcing groups to abandon their shelters and begin the search for new ones. The earth was a restless stage, and humanity was only learning how to survive its performance. Many species did not make it. Entire lineages of plants and animals disappeared when the environment shifted faster than they could adapt. Some large animals thrived in the cold but died when the world grew warm again. Others managed well in forests, but could not endure the open grasslands that replaced them. Extinction was constant, and our ancestors walked among the ruins of species that once dominated the land. Each disappearance was a reminder of how fragile life was, how easily the balance could tip toward silence. For early humans, survival meant flexibility. They had to adjust to new foods when old ones vanished, to learn new ways of hunting when familiar animals were gone, to discover new water sources when rivers dried. This need for adaptability shaped not only their tools and shelters, but also their minds. To live in such an unstable world required memory of what had worked before and imagination for what might work next. It required cooperation because no single person could endure the storms and droughts alone. Out of these hardships grew habits of sharing, planning, and supporting one another. The environment did not only shape survival, it also shaped migration. Each swing of climate pushed humans into new lands, sometimes slowly and sometimes suddenly. Groups spread into valleys when food was plentiful, then retreated to higher ground when floods came. They crossed open plains in search of animals, then huddled in caves when cold winds blew across the land. Over generations, this restless movement expanded their reach, teaching them to endure deserts, forests, mountains, and eventually ice itself. Picture a group of early humans standing at the edge of a dried river. The cracked earth stretches out beneath their feet. The air is hot and heavy, and the last traces of water shimmer faintly in the distance. They know they cannot stay. They gather their children, their tools, and what little food they have left, and they begin to walk. Days later, perhaps weeks, they find a new stream, shaded by trees and alive with fish. The relief is not just survival for the day, but the promise of another generation, another chance for their lineage to continue. These were not isolated struggles. They were the rhythm of existence itself. Every ice sheet, every drought, every sudden flood etched resilience into the human story. Those who could not bend to the earth's demands disappeared. Those who could bend carried the story forward. It was in these endless crises that humanity's character was shaped, forged not by peace or stability, but by the constant need to change. The mind, the body, and the spirit of our ancestors were sharpened in this chaos, and as the world continued to shift, each new challenge pulled them closer to becoming the humans we recognize today. The journey was far from over, and as the climate continued its restless dance, it set the stage for encounters with other humans who would soon appear across the world. As waves of ice ages continued to sweep across the planet, not all humans faced the cold in the same way. In the frozen landscapes of Europe and Western Asia, a new kind of human emerged. They were shorter, stockier, and far more muscular than the slender Homo sapiens who would appear later in Africa. Their bodies were shaped for survival in bitter cold, with broad rib cages to hold powerful lungs, thick limbs to generate strength, and faces framed by heavy brows. These were the Neanderthals, and for hundreds of thousands of years, they thrived in places where the winters never seemed to end. Neanderthals were extraordinary hunters. Imagine them stalking herds of mammoths across frozen plains, their breath rising in the icy air as they moved in careful formation. Their arms and shoulders were built with immense strength, capable of thrusting heavy spears into the hides of animals that weighed several tons. They hunted not only mammoths, but also woolly rhinoceroses, bison, and giant deer, all of which demanded skill, planning, and courage. These were not fragile beings. They were among the most formidable hunters the Ice Age had ever produced. But their survival was not only about strength. Neanderthals also had minds capable of remarkable innovation. Their tools were far more sophisticated than the simple flakes once struck by Homo habilis. They shaped stone into carefully crafted blades, scrapers, and points, each designed with a specific purpose. Some tools were hafted onto wooden shafts to create spears, while others were used to scrape hides for clothing or carve wood for shelters. The precision of their tool-making reveals careful thought, attention to detail, and a deep knowledge of their environment. They were also masters of fire. Hearths have been found in the caves they occupied, darkened with soot from countless nights spent around the flames. Here they cooked meat, warmed themselves against the freezing cold, and perhaps told stories in flickering light. Fire gave them more than survival, it gave them time. In the glow of those hearths, Neanderthals could plan hunts, teach their young, and strengthen bonds with one another. Evidence suggests they lived in close-knit groups, often returning to the same caves year after year. They cared for their sick and injured, which tells us something profound about their humanity. Skeletons show signs of individuals who lived long after suffering wounds that would have made them unable to hunt or fend for themselves. Their survival was only possible because others provided for them. In this way, Neanderthals reveal a deep capacity for compassion. They were not just hunters, they were caretakers. And yet, for all their strength and skill, Neanderthals vanished. This is one of the great mysteries of human history. For more than 300,000 years they dominated Europe, enduring harsh winters and shifting climates. Then, within a short span after Homo sapiens arrived, they were gone. Their bones are found in caves, their tools lie buried in ancient soil, but their voices are silent. Why did they disappear if they were so strong? Was it competition with our own species, who may have been more adaptable and more numerous? Was it climate change that pushed them past the edge of survival? Did disease weaken them, or did interbreeding slowly merge them into us until their distinct identity was lost? The answers remain uncertain, though fragments of the truth lie hidden in DNA. We now know that every person alive today carries small traces of Neanderthal genes, whispers of their existence still alive in our blood. It is haunting to imagine them watching the arrival of other humans on their hunting grounds, seeing strangers with different faces and different tools appear at the edge of their world. Perhaps they fought, perhaps they traded, perhaps they even loved, but in the end, only one lineage survived to tell the story. The Neanderthals, so powerful and so capable, became shadows of memory, their fate one of history's most poignant questions. And as their world faded into silence, the story of humanity continued, shaped not only by what we became, but also by what was lost along the way. From the ashes of their hearths and the edges of their stone blades, we carry both their strength and their absence into the next chapter of our journey. While Neanderthals roamed the frozen plains of Europe, another branch of humanity was living far to the east, hidden in the mountains of Siberia and beyond. For a long time, no one knew they existed. Their presence left almost no trace in the soil, No grand bones to fill museum shelves, no carved tools scattered across the earth in abundance. For tens of thousands of years, they were invisible. Then, in the early 21st century, a fragment of bone found in a cave began to whisper their story. This was the discovery of the Denisovans. The cave where they were found lies in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a quiet place of shadows and stone. Archaeologists unearthed what seemed like little more than a sliver of bone from the finger of a child, no larger than a coin. To the naked eye, it looked unremarkable. But when scientists studied its DNA, they realized they had stumbled upon an entirely new kind of human. The Denisovans were not Neanderthals, and they were not Homo sapiens. They were a distinct people, close cousins who had lived and thrived in their own corner of the world. What makes the Denisovans so mysterious is that almost everything we know about them comes from genetic clues. Unlike Neanderthals, whose skeletons and tools are found in many sites, Denisovan remains are rare. Beyond that single finger bone, a few teeth, and fragments of skull, there is almost nothing. Yet from those tiny fragments, their DNA has revealed entire histories. It is a reminder that even when bones crumble and artifacts vanish, traces of life can still be written deep in genetic code. The DNA of Denisovans told us not only who they were, but also how they lived within us. When Homo sapiens began spreading across Asia, they encountered these mysterious humans. They did not only compete with them, they mingled with them, shared their lives, and interbred. The evidence lies in us today. People in parts of Asia, Australia, and the Pacific Islands still carry Denisovan genes. In fact, some of those genes give unique advantages, such as the ability of certain populations in Tibet to live at high altitudes where oxygen is thin. These invisible ancestors are still helping us survive in the present, even though their own kind vanished long ago. Think about the emotional weight of this. You and I carry within our bodies not only the echoes of Neanderthals, but also the ghosts of Denisovans. Their DNA hums quietly in our cells, silent but enduring, like voices that never fade. They are the invisible companions of our story, erased from the world, yet alive in our very blood. Their faces are unknown to us, their languages unheard, their songs forever lost, yet they walk with us, hidden in every heartbeat. When we speak of ancestors, we often imagine a line stretching neatly from the past to the present, but the truth is far more complex, far more haunting. Humanity was never one straight path. It was a forest of branches, crossing and intertwining, sometimes breaking, sometimes merging again. Denisovans remind us that many of those branches did not disappear completely. They bent into us, leaving their roots inside our bodies, shaping who we are in ways we can barely comprehend. The Denisovan story also highlights how fragile our understanding of the past truly is. For decades, scientists had no idea they even existed, and then a single fragment of bone rewrote the map of human history. If so much can be revealed by such a small discovery, what else might still lie hidden beneath the soil or in the forgotten corners of caves? Perhaps there are other ghosts waiting to be found, other relatives whose presence lingers only in our genes. It is haunting to imagine these people, living in the same world as Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, sharing fires, exchanging tools, perhaps raising children together, and yet vanishing almost without a trace. No one knows exactly when or why the Denisovans disappeared, but their absence is not complete. They are not gone in the way other species are gone. They are hidden, folded into the blueprint of our bodies, silent partners in the story of becoming human. And as we look deeper into our DNA, the ghosts continue to speak. They remind us that we are not alone in our lineage, that humanity is not only us, but also the fragments of those who walked before us. Their shadows stretch into our present, guiding us quietly, invisibly, into the next chapters of our journey. For millions of years, many kinds of humans walked the earth. Neanderthals braved the cold of Europe. Denisovans lingered quietly in the mountains of Asia. Earlier ancestors like Homo erectus carried fire across continents, yet in Africa, something new was beginning to take shape. Around 300,000 years ago, a different kind of human appeared. They were us, Homo sapiens. At first glance, they may not have seemed extraordinary. Their bodies were not as stocky as Neanderthals. Their muscles were not as powerful as those of earlier hunters. But their bones tell a subtle story of change. Skulls became more rounded, with high foreheads and lighter brow ridges. Faces grew flatter, jaws smaller, and teeth less pronounced. Bodies were slimmer, more suited to endurance than brute strength. These anatomical shifts may look simple, but they carried with them a hidden transformation. Inside those rounder skulls lay a brain with new potential. The difference was not only size, but structure. Brains in Homo sapiens began to wire themselves in ways that allowed connections to stretch across regions, linking memory with imagination, sensation with language, and planning with creativity. These were not just thinking brains, they were dreaming brains. They could picture a hunt before it happened. They could imagine dangers and prepare for them. They could create symbols, stories, and visions of things that did not yet exist. This was the birth of imagination, and it lit a spark unlike anything the world had ever seen. Other humans made tools and hunted skillfully, but Homo sapiens began to think beyond the immediate task. They carved shapes into stone, not because they needed sharper blades, but because they saw beauty in patterns. They mixed pigments from earth and ash to paint their bodies or decorate the walls of caves. They strung shells and beads into ornaments that had no survival value, yet carried meaning, signs of identity, of belonging, of something abstract and shared. Imagine the scene. A group gathered around a fire on the African savanna, shadows dancing against their faces. One person picks up a piece of ochre and scratches a design into the surface of a rock. Another hums a rhythm, while children watch and mimic. In that moment, survival is not only about food or warmth, it is about connection, about leaving a mark, about creating something that will outlast the night. This was what set Homo sapiens apart. Their world was not limited to what they could touch or see. They carried invisible worlds inside their minds. They imagined gods in the stars, spirits in the wind, and stories that explained who they were. They planned migrations long before they began them, dreaming of rivers and valleys they had not yet crossed. They imagined weapons before they were built, songs before they were sung, and futures before they existed. Their anatomy supported this new way of being. The shape of their larynx and the fine control of their tongue and mouth made complex speech possible. Words began to flow, carrying not only warnings or commands, but questions, ideas, and stories. With language, knowledge could be shared across generations, allowing children to learn not only from their own experience, but from the lives of those who came before them. The emotional weight of this change is immense. For the first time, humans were not only surviving the present, but weaving meaning out of it. They were able to step outside the boundaries of instinct and enter the realm of imagination. Every song, every carved bead, every handprint on a cave wall is a reminder that they were thinking as we think, feeling as we feel, reaching for something greater than survival. It is humbling to realize that every modern human carries this inheritance. The rounded skull, the subtle jawline, The ability to speak and imagine all of it began with those early Homo sapiens in Africa. From them came every work of art, every invention, every idea that has ever shaped the world. Their spark was the beginning of the human story as we recognize it today, a story that would soon carry them out of Africa to encounter other humans, to share the earth with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and to eventually inherit a world that once seemed far too vast for any single species to claim. With the arrival of Homo sapiens in Africa, the human mind had begun to imagine worlds beyond what the eyes could see. At first, those visions lived only in thoughts, in spoken words, and in fleeting gestures around the fire. But soon, imagination spilled out of the mind and onto the world itself. Hands that once shaped stone and carried food now began to shape symbols, colors, and patterns. The world was no longer only survived in, it was expressed in. This was the birth of art. The earliest artists were not working with canvases or brushes, but with stone walls, bones, shells, and earth itself. In caves scattered across Africa, Europe, and Asia, they left behind paintings that still take our breath away tens of thousands of years later. Deep in the dark chambers of caves, far from sunlight, they painted herds of bison, galloping horses, and woolly mammoths. They used red ochre, charcoal, and yellow clays ground from the earth, blowing pigment across their hands to leave ghostly stencils, or sketching the outlines of animals with fingers and simple tools. The walls flickered in the light of torches, as if the animals were alive, running in eternal motion across stone. But these were not just pictures of animals. They carried meaning. They were symbols, memories, and declarations of thought. Some believe these paintings may have been part of rituals, perhaps connected to hunting magic, a way to ensure success. Others see them as the first stories, recorded for others to witness. Whatever their purpose, they reveal a mind capable of imagining something beyond the present moment, a mind that wanted to make ideas permanent, to reach beyond the limits of spoken words. Art did not stop at cave walls. Humans carved shapes into bone and ivory, creating figurines of animals, people, and mysterious hybrid beings. Some of the earliest carvings show women with exaggerated features, often called Venus figurines, perhaps symbols of fertility, life, and continuity. These small objects, held in the palm, were more than decorations. They were symbols that carried weight across generations. They whispered of hopes, fears, and meanings that words alone could not contain. Beads and ornaments also began to appear, shells drilled with holes, animal teeth strung into necklaces, stones polished smooth and worn close to the body. These were not tools for survival. They were tools of identity. They told others who a person was, where they belonged, and what they valued. For the first time, humans began to wear their ideas. A necklace was not only an ornament, it was a message. I exist. I am part of this group. I matter. The emotional power of this moment in history cannot be overstated. Art is the signature of consciousness. It is proof that humans were no longer living only in the physical world, but in a symbolic one. They were creating not only for function, but for meaning. Every painted handprint on a cave wall is a whisper across tens of thousands of years, saying, I was here, do not forget me. It is easy to imagine a group gathered inside a dark cave, the air heavy with smoke from torches. A figure kneels before the wall, grinding pigment between stone, mixing it with spit or animal fat, and pressing color onto the surface. Around them, children watch in awe, learning not only the shapes but the act itself, absorbing the idea that humans can make marks that outlast a single life. In that moment, survival had transformed into expression. Existence had become meaning. This was a turning point unlike any before. Tools had shaped survival, fire had shaped safety, but art shaped identity. Through paintings, carvings, and beads, humans began to declare their place in the world. They were not only reacting to nature, they were speaking back to it. They were saying, "We exist, and our existence has meaning." And from this spark of imagination made visible, humanity carried forward something even more powerful than art itself: the ability to connect through symbols, to communicate beyond time, and to carry stories not only with words, but with images and objects. This was only the beginning, for soon those symbols would encounter other humans in distant lands, creating moments of tension, cooperation, and exchange that would forever alter the course of our journey. As Homo sapiens spread outward from Africa, carrying imagination and art, they did not walk into an empty world. Other humans were already there. In the frozen valleys of Europe, the Neanderthals had built lives of strength and endurance. In the shadowed mountains of Asia, the mysterious Denisovans lingered, their presence marked more in genes than in bones. The Earth, at this time, was not a world of one humanity, but of many, and eventually their paths crossed. The first encounters between Homo sapiens and other humans must have been charged with tension. Imagine stepping out of the forest and seeing a figure in the distance. At first glance, they look like you. They walk upright, they carry tools, they hold fire. Their eyes meet yours, and they are undeniably human, yet not the same. The recognition is immediate, and with it comes both curiosity and fear. Were these strangers friends, enemies, or something in between? Archaeological evidence tells us that encounters between species were complex. In some places, there was competition. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals often hunted the same animals, gathered the same plants, and sought shelter in the same caves. Resources were limited, and each group's survival meant the other had less. Conflict was likely unavoidable at times, and the bones of both species suggest moments of violence. Spears may have been raised not only against mammoths, but against rivals who looked eerily familiar. Yet in other places, the story was very different. There are signs of cooperation, of knowledge exchanged, and perhaps even of lives shared. Some tools found in Europe seem to carry elements of both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens design, suggesting that ideas flowed between them. Firelight may have revealed not only the faces of one's own people, but also of strangers welcomed into the circle. And then there is the evidence written into our DNA. Modern humans today carry fragments of Neanderthal genes, and many populations in Asia and the Pacific also carry Denisovan ancestry. These traces prove that the encounters were not only about competition or war, they were also about intimacy. They were about bodies joined, children born, and lineages blended. Where groups met, love and desire crossed boundaries, leaving echoes that still live within us now. The emotional tension of these moments is profound. Imagine two groups approaching one another after weeks of watching from a distance. Their languages are different, their gestures unfamiliar, yet something bridges the gap. Perhaps it was trade, the exchange of shells, hides, or stone blades. Perhaps it was a shared hunt, joining forces against a massive animal neither group could face alone. Or perhaps it was something even more personal, a glance exchanged between two individuals, a bond formed that defied the division of species. Was it love? Was it necessity? Was it both? We may never know the details, but the results are written into us. Every time you breathe, every heartbeat in your chest carries traces of those encounters. The Denisovan genes that help certain people live at high altitudes, the Neanderthal fragments that influence skin, hair, and even aspects of immunity, all of these are gifts from meetings long ago. The line between us and them was never absolute. It was blurred, crossed, and merged. And yet, not all of them survived. In time, Neanderthals and Denisovans faded from the earth, leaving Homo sapiens as the last humans standing. But they are not entirely gone. Their shadows live inside us, invisible but enduring, whispering across the generations. The story of our species is not one of isolation, but of contact, conflict, cooperation, and connection. Humanity was never singular. It was always plural, always entangled with others. As our ancestors carried forward, they did so not only with their own traits, but also with the legacy of these encounters. Every story we tell today, every invention, every gesture of love or war, is touched by the fact that long ago, in caves and valleys and mountains, humans met other humans, and the boundary between them dissolved. When Homo sapiens met Neanderthals and Denisovans, those encounters did not vanish into silence. They left echoes that still live within us today, not in caves or tools, but deep inside our bodies. Every person alive carries fragments of DNA from humans who no longer walk the earth. They are gone, yet they remain, hidden in our cells, shaping us in ways both visible and invisible. The vanished still walk with us, stitched into our very being. Modern genetics has revealed just how intertwined these lost peoples are with us. For those of European or Asian ancestry, between 1 and 2% of their DNA comes from Neanderthals. For people in parts of Asia, Melanesia, and the Pacific Islands, up to 5% of their DNA can be traced back to Denisovans. At first glance, these numbers may seem small, but in reality, they are immense. Out of the billions of base pairs that make up the human genome, countless fragments come from species that no longer exist. These fragments are more than just reminders. They are survival gifts, passed down across thousands of generations. Some of these genes help our bodies adapt to the environments we live in. From Neanderthals, we inherited traits linked to skin and hair, helping our ancestors endure the cold, dim winters of Ice Age Europe. From Denisovans came adaptations for high-altitude living. The people of Tibet, for example, can thrive in thin mountain air because of genetic legacies from these long-vanished cousins. Without those gifts, life at the top of the world might have been impossible. Other genes shape our immune systems. Encounters with different climates, plants, and diseases meant that Neanderthals and Denisovans carried immune defenses that Homo sapiens did not yet have. By interbreeding with them, our ancestors borrowed those defenses, fortifying themselves against illnesses that would have otherwise devastated them. Even now, your body's ability to fight infection may be influenced by DNA that once belonged to another kind of human entirely. The emotional weight of this truth is haunting. Imagine that within your own body, in the very structure of your cells, you carry fragments of people who vanished tens of thousands of years ago. They left behind no cities, no written words, no lasting monuments, and yet they endure not in stone or story, but in you. When you take a breath, when your heart beats, when your skin protects you against the elements, part of that is the legacy of Neanderthals and Denisovans. They are not gone. They are inside us, alive in every moment of our existence. It also means that humanity has never been a single, isolated species. We are not a pure line, but a mosaic. The borders between us and them blurred and merged long ago. Our bodies are living records of meetings around fires, of children born to parents from different worlds, of love, survival, and necessity intertwined. The story of Homo sapiens is not only our own, It is also the story of others who are gone but still whisper in our blood. Consider what this means for how we think of ourselves. Every face you see, every person alive today, is shaped by ancestors we cannot fully imagine. Your ability to adapt, to breathe at high altitudes, to resist certain diseases, or even the color of your skin or the texture of your hair may all be gifts from humans who disappeared long ago. They never knew you. You will never know them. Yet without them, you might not be here at all. The vanished still speak, not through words, but through the quiet code of life that runs inside us. Their presence is a reminder that nothing is truly lost. Even when a people disappears from the earth, echoes of their existence ripple forward, carried in the bodies of those who follow. We are proof that they lived, and in living, they gave us part of themselves. And as our story continues, we carry them with us into every new challenge. Their fragments live on in our struggles and in our triumphs, in our weaknesses and in our strength. The Neanderthals and Denisovans may no longer walk the land, but their legacy walks within us, shaping who we are and who we will become. The gift of DNA from vanished peoples still lingers in our bodies, but another gift entirely our own would soon become the greatest weapon humanity ever wielded. It was not sharper than stone, nor hotter than fire. It was not carried in the hand, but in the breath. This was language, the weaving of sounds into meaning, the birth of words that could echo across the plains and bind minds together. Other creatures make sounds. Birds sing, wolves howl, chimpanzees call to one another in the forest, but human language is something different. It is not only about warning or calling, it is about imagining, describing, and connecting. It is about carrying what is inside one mind and planting it into another. The rise of complex speech turned survival into collaboration, and collaboration into power. Imagine an ancient hunt. A group of early Homo sapiens moves silently through tall grass, their eyes fixed on a herd of antelope in the distance. Before language, each hunter would have to rely on instinct or mimicry to guess what the others might do. But with language, one voice can whisper a plan. Words can divide roles, timing, and strategy. You circle to the left. I will wait here. When the herd runs, drive them toward the cliff. A few short phrases can transform scattered individuals into a united force. With coordinated hunts, humans began to bring down prey larger than themselves, animals that no single hunter could ever face alone. Language gave them power over creatures stronger and faster, not by muscle, but by shared thought. But language was more than a hunting tool. Around the fire at night, words became stories. Parents could teach their children not just through action, but through explanation. This plant heals, that one poisons. Follow the river when the stars rise. With each spoken lesson, knowledge outlived the one who first discovered it. A child could inherit not only genes from their parents, but wisdom carried in words. For the first time, information was no longer trapped within a single generation. It flowed forward, accumulating like water filling a reservoir, building upon itself with each telling. Storytelling was also more than instruction. It gave shape to imagination. In the flickering firelight, voices told tales of spirits in the wind, of ancestors who guided the living, of animals who taught lessons through their behavior. These stories carried more than facts. They carried meaning, comfort, and identity. They bound groups together, creating shared beliefs that turned small bands into communities with common purpose. Words gave humans not only survival, but belonging. The emotional power of language is immense. Picture voices rising over the savannah, carried by wind across the night. The sound is more than noise. It is a bridge between minds, a thread weaving together fear, hope, and memory. A whispered warning saves a life, a shouted call unites a hunt, a gentle story calms a restless child. In words, humanity found a way to endure not only the dangers of the world, but the loneliness of existence. The physical changes that made speech possible were as remarkable as the language itself. The shape of the human larynx, the fine control of the tongue, the flexibility of lips and breath, all came together to produce a vast range of sounds. Unlike other primates, humans could combine vowels and consonants into endless patterns. Every new sound could be linked to an idea, and every idea could be combined with others to create new ones. Language was not fixed, it was infinite. This infinity is what made it a weapon unlike any spear or blade. With words, humans could share dreams before they happened, describe places unseen, and plan for futures not yet real. They could cooperate on scales no other creature could imagine. Ants may work together by instinct, but humans work together by choice, guided by words, and as words spread, they shaped culture, memory, and imagination in ways that carried us further than fire or stone ever could. Even now, we feel the weight of this gift. Every conversation, every lullaby, every whispered secret is part of the same river that began to flow tens of thousands of years ago. The voices of our ancestors are still with us, echoing across time, reminding us that without words, there would be no story to tell at all. And as language deepened, so too did the power it gave. Words not only taught and comforted, they also organized. They united hunters into armies, neighbors into tribes, and tribes into nations. This weapon, forged not in iron but in sound, would shape the rise of humans more than any other invention. And with language at their side, our ancestors began to turn not only into survivors, but into rulers of the world around them. With words flowing across ancient plains, humans no longer faced the world as scattered individuals. Language gave them unity, and unity turned into power. For millions of years, humans had lived in fear of the great predators around them. Lions stalked the grasslands, packs of wolves prowled the forests, and saber-toothed cats waited in the shadows. Our ancestors were small, vulnerable, and fragile compared to these beasts. But with imagination, with planning, and with words, something extraordinary began to happen. The predators that once ruled the earth began to fall, one by one, to human hands. The first weapon of this transformation was the spear. At first, it was nothing more than a sharpened stick, hardened in fire to give it strength. But even that simple tool shifted the balance. A thrusting spear allowed humans to keep distance between themselves and their prey. They no longer had to rely on teeth or nails, which could never match the claws of a lion or the jaws of a hyena. A spear turned the frail human arm into something deadly, and then came the leap forward, the throwing spear. With practice, humans could strike from a distance, piercing the hides of animals that once seemed untouchable. But the real revolution came when hunting stopped being the act of a single person and became the act of many. Coordinated by language, hunters could work together, spreading out to encircle herds or drive animals toward traps. They could plan ambushes, anticipating how their prey would move and guiding it exactly where they wanted it to go. A group of humans with spears was more than just a gathering. It was a new kind of predator, one that thought as a single body, one that could bring down animals many times larger and stronger than themselves. The bow and arrow would later magnify this power. A bow was more than just a weapon, it was an extension of imagination. To build one required planning, patience, and skill. A flexible piece of wood bent and strung with sinew, a shaft tipped with sharpened stone or bone, all combined into a tool that could kill silently from a great distance. With bows in their hands, humans no longer had to approach dangerous animals closely. They could stand apart, hidden in shadows, and strike before their prey even knew danger was near. This technology transformed hunting into something precise and deadly. Picture the moment when the roles began to reverse. A pack of wolves closes in on a group of humans, teeth bared, ready to tear flesh. But the humans are not running. They are standing together, spears raised, voices calling out commands. A volley of arrows flies through the air, striking into the pack. The predators scatter, howling in pain and confusion. For the first time, the hunters have become the hunted. The throne of terror begins to shift. This was not only about survival, it was about dominance. With their new weapons and coordinated hunts, humans began to climb to the very top of the food chain. Mammoths, towering giants of the Ice Age, fell to human strategies. Enormous bison, swift gazelles, and even dangerous predators like cave lions or bears could be driven into traps or overwhelmed by coordinated attack. No other species had ever claimed so wide a range of prey, from small birds to massive elephants. Humans were no longer just one animal among many. They were becoming the apex predator, reshaping entire ecosystems in their wake. And with this rise came a profound emotional shift. For millions of years, humans had lived in fear of the dark, of the creatures that prowled just beyond the firelight. Now, those creatures began to fear us. The night still held its dangers, but it also carried the sound of human voices echoing across the plains, voices that spoke of hunts won, of prey brought down, of courage shared. Fear began to move from our hearts into the hearts of others. It is haunting to think of the moment when this pivot occurred. The earth had always been ruled by teeth, claws, and muscle, but now fragile beings with fire, stone, and words claimed that throne. They did not take it by strength alone, but by imagination, cooperation, and relentless will. From that moment on, no predator would ever dominate humanity again. The age of fear was ending. The age of human mastery had begun. Once humans had learned to master the land, their eyes turned to the waters that stretched beyond sight. Rivers and lakes had long been crossed on simple logs or bundles of reeds, but the greatest barrier was the ocean. To step into the sea was to step into mystery, into a world where horizons swallowed the land, and the line between survival and death was as thin as a wave. Yet even this did not stop our ancestors. With courage and ingenuity, they began to build vessels that could carry them farther than any human had ever traveled before. Evidence of early seafaring is scattered, but powerful. As far back as 50,000 years ago, humans were already crossing stretches of open water. Stone tools have been discovered on islands that were never connected to the mainland by land bridges, meaning that the only way to reach them was by boat. These journeys were not accidents. They required planning, cooperation, and a willingness to risk everything for the hope of something new. One of the most astonishing feats of this era was the colonization of Australia. Around 65,000 years ago, humans set out from Southeast Asia and crossed a vast series of seas to reach the continent. Even at their lowest levels during ice ages, these waters stretched dozens of miles wide. The land on the other side could not always be seen. To sail into them was to trust the horizon, to push forward into uncertainty. Imagine the scene. A group of humans gathers at the edge of the sea. They have built rafts from wood and vines, lashed together with the strength of their hands and the knowledge passed down from others before them. They carry fire wrapped in husks, food tied in bundles, children pressed close against their mothers. The night is filled with the sound of waves, and the stars shimmer above, reflecting on the restless water. At dawn, they push off, the land shrinking behind them as the ocean swallows the edges of their world. Around them is nothing but water and sky. The courage of that moment is staggering. To step into a fragile vessel of reeds or wood, knowing that one wrong storm or one broken lash of rope could mean the end, required faith unlike any other. And yet, they did it. Again and again, across generations, humans launched themselves into the sea, guided by stars, by currents, and by memory. Some may have vanished, their rafts broken, and their voices lost to the waves. But others succeeded, and with their success, the human story expanded to new continents. When they arrived in Australia, they encountered landscapes unlike anything they had known before. Towering marsupials roamed the plains, giant wombats and kangaroos far larger than any today. The land pulsed with new sounds, new smells, new dangers, yet within a short time, humans adapted, crafting tools and hunting strategies that fit this new environment. They carried with them fire, shaping the land by burning fields to encourage new growth and lure animals into the open. Their presence changed Australia forever, just as it had changed every land they touched before. The emotional power of these ocean crossings lies in their fragility. Unlike the confident steps of hunters on land, each journey into the sea was a gamble with fate. A raft could be swept off course, a sudden storm could scatter travelers into the deep, and hunger or thirst could steal lives before land was reached again. Still, humans pushed onward. There was something within them, curiosity, desperation, or perhaps both, that would not let them stop. This pattern, once begun, would never truly end. The same impulse that drove those early voyagers into the waters would one day carry Polynesians across the Pacific, Vikings across the North Atlantic, and astronauts beyond the Earth itself. But it all began here, with fragile vessels rising and falling on endless waves, driven by the courage of people who believed there was something waiting beyond the horizon. Every time you see the ocean today, you can imagine them. Small figures in rafts, silhouetted against the rising sunlight, paddling toward a world they could not yet see, carrying with them not only their children and their tools, but the hopes of all who came before. It is because of them that humanity's story is not only one of land, but of water. From the warm coasts of Africa and the wide seas that carried us into Australia, the journey of humanity pressed onward into one of the harshest places imaginable. During the Ice Age, Europe was not the land of rolling fields and villages it would later become. It was a world of glaciers stretching like frozen mountains across the horizon, rivers locked under sheets of ice, and winters that swallowed the land in darkness for months at a time. To live here was to live on the edge of death. And yet, our ancestors stepped into this frozen world and found ways to endure. The cold of Ice Age Europe was unlike anything most of us can imagine. Temperatures dropped so low that even breathing could burn the lungs. Snowstorms rolled across plains without warning, blotting out sight and sound until the world became a white void. Predators prowled the edges, cave lions, wolves, and hyenas, all just as hungry, all just as desperate. For humans, survival meant finding ways to outthink both the weather and the beasts that stalked the night. The first defense was clothing. Earlier ancestors had used animal skins, but in the frozen north, clothing became a necessity, not a choice. Hides were scraped clean, softened, and stitched together with bone needles. Layers of fur wrapped the body, insulating against the bitter winds. Boots and gloves were fashioned from hide and lined with warmth. These garments were not simple coverings, they were armor against the cold, shields that allowed fragile human bodies to endure where bare skin would perish in minutes. Shelter was another necessity. Caves offered natural refuge, but caves were not always nearby or safe, so humans began to build. In some regions, they used mammoth bones to construct the frames of huts, covering them with hides to create shelters strong enough to withstand the winds. In others, snow itself became a resource, packed and carved into domes that held warmth inside. Fires burned constantly within these shelters, not only for heat, but for light, for cooking, and for the comfort of knowing the dark had been pushed a little farther away. Hunting in this frozen land demanded courage. The animals were enormous woolly mammoths, giant bison, and reindeer that moved in vast herds across the plains. A single kill could feed an entire group for weeks, but bringing down such creatures was perilous. Hunters armed with spears worked in coordinated teams, driving animals into traps or toward waiting ambushes. Sometimes they targeted the weak or the young. Sometimes they risked everything against the giants. The danger was immense, but the reward was life itself. The meat provided food, the hides became clothing, the bones became tools and shelters. In this world, no part of an animal was wasted. Survival meant using every gift the land provided. Yet even with clothing, fire, and weapons, the frozen north was a place that seemed determined to drive humans out. Food could vanish when herds migrated. Storms could destroy shelters. Illness or injury in such conditions was often fatal. Every day was a test, and the margin between life and death was painfully thin. Still, humans endured. They adapted not by being stronger than the cold, but by being more inventive than it. Each generation carried forward new lessons: how to track animals across snow, how to store food in frozen ground, how to share warmth and resources when times grew desperate. The emotional weight of this struggle is immense. Imagine standing on a windswept plain, the sky gray and heavy, the snow biting at your skin. In the distance, a herd of mammoths moves slowly, their massive forms breaking the monotony of ice and snow. Around you, your people stand, bundled in furs, spears in hand, faces set with determination. The cold presses against you, relentless, unforgiving. It feels as if the world itself wants you gone. And yet, here you are. You move forward. You endure. In these frozen lands, humanity proved something vital. We were not only wanderers or hunters, we were survivors of a world that seemed designed to kill us. The glaciers tried to crush us, the winds tried to freeze us, the predators tried to consume us, but still we found ways to carve out existence in the silence of the ice. Every step across that frozen ground was a declaration that humans would not vanish, no matter how harsh the earth became. And as the ice age deepened, pushing life to its very limits, humanity faced even greater tests. There were times when our numbers dwindled so low that the entire species hovered at the edge of extinction. These bottlenecks would shape our destiny, reminding us again and again that survival was never guaranteed, only earned. The frozen north was a place of unrelenting challenge, but the cold was only part of the struggle. Across the long sweep of human history, there were moments when survival itself teetered on the very edge, when our species came closer than ever to disappearing entirely. Today, scientists can trace these near extinctions not only through fossils or artifacts, but through the very code inside our bodies. Our DNA carries the record of times when humanity was reduced to only a fragile handful, a bottleneck so narrow that it is almost impossible to believe we made it through. Genetic evidence suggests that there were points when the global population of humans fell below 10,000 individuals. To put that into perspective, that is fewer people than would fit into a modern sports arena. Imagine all of humanity reduced to the size of a single small town, scattered in isolated groups across vast continents. One great storm, one prolonged drought, one disease spreading unchecked, any of these could have ended our story before it truly began. One of the most dramatic examples may have happened around 70,000 years ago, linked by some researchers to the eruption of a volcano called Toba in what is now Indonesia. This eruption was one of the largest in the last 2 million years. Ash may have spread across continents, darkening skies, lowering global temperatures, and choking ecosystems already under strain. Plants would have withered, animals would have died off, and human groups, depending on both, would have faced famine. The result may have been a devastating crash in numbers, a bottleneck so severe that only a few thousand people carried humanity forward. Even without cataclysms like Toba, the shifting climate of the ice ages pressed relentlessly on fragile populations. Periods of drought stretched across Africa, shrinking lakes into dust and forcing groups to abandon once fertile valleys. Sea levels rose and fell, cutting off migration routes. Entire herds of animals vanished as habitats changed, leaving human hunters desperate for food. At these times, starvation was not a possibility, it was a constant threat. To be born then was to inherit a world in collapse, where each day was a test against forces far larger than any individual could fight. And yet, someone survived. Every person listening to this carries bloodlines that passed through those trials. Your very existence is proof that your ancestors were among the few who endured. They were the ones who found water when rivers dried, who shared food when there was almost none left, who kept fire alive in storms and built shelter against merciless winds. They were not just lucky, they were resilient. Their survival was purchased with courage, sacrifice, and ingenuity. It is humbling to imagine how narrow the thread truly was. Had even a few more groups perished, had a few more children failed to grow into adults, the human story might have ended quietly, leaving the earth to other creatures. The fact that we are here at all is a miracle written into our DNA. Our genomes show the marks of these bottlenecks, scars of near extinction preserved in every cell. When scientists study those patterns, they see not only evidence of loss, but also of endurance. Emotionally, this realization changes how we see ourselves. Each of us is the descendant of survivors, of people who stood against famine, fire, and ice, and did not fall. The line that connects you to the past was fragile, stretched thin across storms and centuries, yet it never snapped. Every heartbeat you feel is a reminder of that unbroken chain. You are living proof that against impossible odds, someone made it through. And from those few survivors, humanity grew again. Their children spread outward, filling valleys and coasts once more, carrying the lessons of hardship in their stories and in their blood. But survival never came easily. Each expansion brought new challenges, new dangers, and new ways to adapt. For when humans finally began to settle, to tame plants and animals, the world would change again, bringing both abundance and unexpected costs. From the razor-thin bottlenecks of near extinction, humanity's numbers slowly grew again. Small groups scattered across valleys and coasts, carrying with them the lessons of scarcity and survival. For hundreds of thousands of years, people had lived as hunters and gatherers, moving with the seasons, following herds of animals, plucking fruits when they ripened, and digging roots when the soil gave them up. The rhythm of life was one of motion, of constant adaptation, of trusting the land to provide just enough, But around 12,000 years ago, in different corners of the world, a quiet revolution began. Humans started to change not only themselves, but the land around them. They became farmers. It is hard to imagine how radical this shift truly was. For countless generations, the only way to survive was to wander. But in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, people began experimenting with wild grains, barley, and wheat. In China, millet and rice were gathered and tended. In the Americas, maize and beans would later rise to prominence. What began as small acts planting seeds near campsites, tending patches of wild plants, noticing which grew best, slowly transformed into deliberate cultivation. Humans were no longer only takers from the land. They had become shapers of it. The same shift happened with animals. For tens of thousands of years, humans had stalked herds of wild sheep, goats, and cattle, hunting them for meat and hides. But at some point, a new thought took hold. What if, instead of chasing them, we kept them near? Slowly, cautiously, animals were domesticated. Sheep and goats were among the first, followed by cattle and pigs. In Asia, people began taming wild oxen, and in the Americas, llamas and alpacas were brought under human care. These animals were not just food. They provided milk, wool, leather, and eventually, the strength to pull plows. The world of humanity began to tether itself to animals, not as prey, but as partners in survival. This change reshaped everything. A planted field could provide more food than gathering alone. A domesticated herd could offer steady resources instead of uncertain hunts. For the first time, humans produced more than they immediately needed. Food surpluses began to appear, small at first, then steadily growing. And with surplus came something extraordinary: the freedom to stay. Groups no longer had to abandon a place when resources ran dry. They could build villages, return to the same plots year after year, and store food for times of scarcity. The land had become not just a provider, but a foundation. The emotional weight of this shift is profound. For millions of years, humans had trusted their feet more than the soil. Motion meant survival. But now, for the first time, they placed their trust in roots, roots of plants, and roots of belonging. To farm was to make a promise to the land. It was to believe that tomorrow would be worth investing in, that seeds placed in the earth today would bear fruit for children not yet born. This tethering to place bound people not only to survival, but to memory. Villages became more than shelters. They became homes, places where generations could layer their lives over one another, leaving behind hearths and tools that their descendants would rediscover centuries later. Yet farming was not an easy life. Fields demanded constant care. Crops could fail if the rains did not come, or if floods swept away the soil. Animals required protection and food of their own. Unlike hunting, where failure meant moving on to try elsewhere, farming tied people to risks they could not always escape, and yet the rewards outweighed the dangers. More food meant more children could survive. Larger groups could gather together, share labor, and build stronger defenses against hardship. Slowly, this tethering to land created the first sparks of civilization. Imagine those early farmers at dawn, bending over fields of wheat that glowed golden in the rising sunlight. Imagine a mother grinding grain between stones, turning it into flour for bread that would feed her family through the day. Picture children chasing lambs through a village, their laughter mingling with the sound of roosters calling to the light. These were not scenes of wandering bands fighting to survive another season. These were moments of settlement, of roots taking hold, of humans learning to live in one place long enough for culture to deepen and memory to stretch further back than any single life. This was the beginning of humanity's long partnership with the land. It was not a clean break from the old ways of hunting and gathering, those persisted for thousands of years alongside farming, but it was the first great turning inward. From this tethering of people to soil, from seeds pressed into earth and animals brought into pens, would rise new forms of life, larger communities, shared rituals, and eventually, civilizations vast enough to cover entire valleys. The age of wandering was giving way to the age of settlement, and with it came both abundance and burdens never known before. The first farmers had tied themselves to the land, planting seeds, tending animals, and trusting that tomorrow would repay the labor of today. This shift brought more food, more stability, and eventually more people. Villages grew into towns, and towns grew into larger communities. For the first time in history, humans were living in groups of hundreds, then thousands, gathered together in ways that hunter-gatherers could never have imagined. It was progress, but progress often comes with a hidden cost. The very abundance that farming created opened the door to new dangers, ones that no stone tool or bow could protect against. One of the most immediate consequences of surplus food was the rise of disease. In small, wandering bands, illnesses burned out quickly, unable to spread far when people moved often and lived in small groups. But in crowded settlements, surrounded by livestock and waste, disease found the perfect environment to thrive. Parasites spread through grain stores. Contaminated water carried sickness from person to person. Viruses that had once lived harmlessly in animals jumped into humans and found fertile ground in the packed conditions of early towns. For the first time, plagues swept through populations, cutting down children and elders alike. Abundance had brought safety from famine, but it also brought new and terrifying vulnerabilities. Surplus food also changed the way people related to one another. In hunter-gatherer groups, sharing had been a necessity. No single person could guarantee survival without the cooperation of others. But once food could be stored and controlled, power began to shift. Some people had more than others, and with that inequality came hierarchy. Leaders emerged who controlled granaries, who oversaw land, who directed the labor of others. Farmers who once worked for themselves now found themselves working for those above them. The tether to land became, for many, a tether to those who claimed ownership of it. Inequality deepened as surpluses grew. The more food that was produced, the more people could be supported. And the more people there were, the more labor could be demanded to build walls, temples, and monuments. The hands that once carved tools for hunting now hauled stones to raise structures whose meanings they may never have fully understood. A paradox unfolded. The very progress that allowed humanity to flourish also created systems of suffering. More mouths were fed, but more backs were bent. It is easy to imagine the emotional weight of this change. For a child born into a small band of hunter-gatherers, life was hard, but it was also free. Each day was spent in the rhythm of the land, moving with the seasons, learning from family, and sharing in what the group had found or hunted. For a child born into the early villages, life was different. The fields demanded constant care. Work began before the sunlight rose and stretched long after it set. Food was more reliable, yes, but the cost was endless toil and vulnerability to forces beyond their control. Even as inequality spread, so too did dependence. Once humans became tied to farms and surplus, there was no turning back. Populations grew too large to return to the old ways of wandering. Land became crowded, fields divided, and disputes over territory erupted into conflict. Walls went up, not only to keep out animals, but to keep out other humans. Farming had given us abundance, but it had also sown the seeds of war. This paradox is one of the most haunting truths of our story. Progress did not only bring comfort, it brought complexity, it brought suffering. Civilization was not born in balance, but in tension. To be human in these times was to stand at the crossroads of abundance and inequality, of safety and sickness, of freedom and burden. The same seeds that gave us bread also gave us division. The same animals that carried our loads also carried new diseases into our blood. The same walls that protected us from outsiders also kept us confined within. And yet, humans endured, adapting even to these new challenges. Villages grew larger still, becoming cities, places where thousands of voices and lives intermingled. The trap of civilization had closed, but inside it, humanity began to create entirely new ways of living, of organizing, and of imagining the world. What began with seeds and soil was now becoming something vast, the rise of societies with rules, governance, and identity stretching beyond kinship. Once farming had tied people to the land, villages grew into towns, and towns began to swell into larger centers of life. With more food came more people, and with more people came complexity. For millions of years, the strongest bond a human could know was family blood ties, small groups bound together by kinship and trust. But in this new world of rising populations, family was no longer enough. Communities were becoming too large for everyone to know one another personally. A new fabric had to be woven, one made not only from blood but from rules, shared beliefs, and governance. Humanity was learning how to live together on a scale it had never attempted before. At first, these rules were likely simple. Agreements about who could farm which plot, who guarded the stores of grain, or how disputes over land and animals were settled. But as populations grew, the web of rules thickened. Leaders emerged, not because they were physically strongest, but because they were skilled at organizing others, at keeping order when chaos threatened. Authority shifted from the individual to the collective, from families to councils, chiefs, or elders who spoke for many. Governance was being born. Conflict came quickly. Where there is land and food, there are also disputes. One village might envy the fertile fields of another, or resent when grazing herds strayed too far. Arguments that once could be solved between families now erupted between groups numbering in the hundreds. Skirmishes broke out, weapons were sharpened, and alliances began to matter as much as strength. To survive, communities forged ties with neighbors, creating bonds of trade or promises of mutual protection. And when these alliances fractured, battles followed, leaving scars not only on the land but on the human spirit. The emotional shift was enormous. For our ancestors, identity had always been simple. You were part of your family, your band, your kin. But now identity was stretching outward, expanding to include strangers who shared no blood yet lived under the same rules. A person was no longer only a child of one family, but a member of a village, a town, or eventually something far larger. These early expansions of identity laid the foundation for what would one day become nations. Picture a crowded settlement thousands of years ago. Families gather in the center of the village, listening as an elder speaks about how grain will be divided or how disputes will be judged. Children, who once would have grown up surrounded only by a small circle of relatives, now play among dozens of others, their laughter filling the air. Farmers from different lineages share labor during planting or harvest. Hunters join forces to protect flocks from predators. Identity is no longer only about who you are born to, but about who you stand beside. With these larger groups came a new kind of imagination. Humans began to tell stories not only about family ancestors, but about shared ancestors, mythical figures, or spirits that united many families under one story. Symbols, flags, totems, or sacred objects emerged to bind people together in ways blood alone never could. These symbols reminded communities that even when individuals quarreled, they belonged to something greater, something worth defending and carrying forward. But the growth of social complexity carried a heavy burden. In larger groups, inequality deepened. Some gained more power over rules, land, and labor than others. Decisions once made by the group now flowed from a few at the top, while those at the bottom bent under the weight of work and obligation. Yet even in this imbalance, people found strength in belonging. To be part of a larger whole meant protection against enemies, a shared identity that gave life meaning beyond the immediate circle of kin. The emotional paradox was clear. In becoming part of these larger groups, humans gained both safety and conflict, both belonging and division. Wars became larger, but so did alliances. Communities became more stable, but also more complex, demanding obedience in exchange for protection. The line of identity, once drawn small and close, was now stretching outward into a tapestry that connected thousands of people under shared rules and beliefs. And from these woven threads, the seeds of civilizations were waiting to sprout. The world was no longer one of small families moving with the seasons. It was becoming a world of cities, trade, and memory carried beyond generations. Yet even as these new forms of society rose, humans sought ways to preserve their experiences, to ensure that their knowledge would not vanish with the passing of elders. Soon, symbols would not only unite communities, but preserve their words forever in stone and clay. As families stretched into villages, and villages swelled into towns and early states, the complexity of human life grew beyond what words alone could carry. Spoken language was powerful, but it was fleeting. A story told around a fire lasted only as long as memory held it. A promise could be forgotten, an agreement could be twisted, a harvest could be remembered wrongly, and debts could be denied. As communities expanded into thousands of people, memory itself became a fragile thread, and so humans began to search for a way to make words last beyond the moment of speaking. From that search, writing was born. The earliest scripts were not elaborate alphabets, but simple marks. In Mesopotamia, around 5,000 years ago, people pressed symbols into wet clay with a reed stylus. These wedge-shaped impressions became what we now call cuneiform. At first, the marks were little more than tallies, records of grain owed or animals traded. But from those humble beginnings, writing grew into something vast, a system capable of capturing stories, laws, prayers, and dreams. In Egypt, writing took the form of hieroglyphs, carved or painted onto stone and papyrus. Each symbol was a picture, part image and part word. They decorated tomb walls with stories of gods, kings, and the journey into the afterlife. In China, early scripts etched onto bones and shells recorded questions posed to the ancestors, scratches that still echo the concerns of long-vanished lives. Across the world, in different places and times, humans independently discovered the same truth, that symbols carved into lasting surfaces could extend memory far beyond a single lifetime. The emotional weight of this innovation is staggering. For the first time, knowledge could leap across generations without being distorted by fading memory. A farmer could record which seasons brought the best harvests, and that record could guide farmers centuries later. A ruler could inscribe laws in stone, and those laws would outlive him, binding people who had never even heard his voice. A poet could carve words into clay, and long after their body returned to dust, their thoughts could still be read by strangers. Writing was not only a tool, It was a kind of immortality. Imagine a scribe bent over a clay tablet in a dim room, carefully pressing signs into the soft surface. Outside, the world hums with the rhythm of trade, animals, and children at play. But inside that tablet, something more permanent is taking shape, a record that will survive storms, floods, and even the death of those who made it. Thousands of years later, when the tablet is uncovered, someone will run their fingers across the same marks and understand what was once thought important. Across centuries, minds will meet. This was the beginning of human memory, breaking free from the fragile confines of the human brain. Until then, the deaths of elders had meant the loss of irreplaceable knowledge. But with writing, knowledge could be stored outside the body, preserved in libraries, carved into monuments, and carried across continents. The past was no longer lost so easily. It was anchored in ink and stone. The invention of writing also deepened identity. Communities no longer defined themselves only by their leaders or their gods, but by the words that captured their stories. Scripts became symbols of culture. To read cuneiform was to belong to Mesopotamia. To trace hieroglyphs was to join the lineage of pharaohs. To inscribe oracle bones was to step into the spiritual world of early China. Words became more than sound. They became heritage. And with writing came power. Those who controlled scripts could shape the lives of thousands. Scribes became vital figures, keepers of contracts, chroniclers of kings, and guardians of memory. Writing was a gift, but also a gate, accessible only to those taught its secrets. This control bound societies together, but it also widened divisions between those who could record their voices and those whose voices faded with the air. Still, the emotional core of writing remained the same: the desire to be remembered. Every carved line, every inked stroke, was an act of defiance against forgetting. A hand pressed into clay was saying, "I was here, and I mattered." A law carved into stone was saying, "This will outlast us." And in those acts, humans found a way to reach beyond the limits of their own lives. The story of writing is the story of memory transformed into permanence. It is the moment when fleeting thought became lasting mark, when breath became stone, when human beings discovered a way to outlive themselves. And from these first scripts, entire civilizations would rise, their voices echoing across millennia, still heard today through the words they left behind. Once words had been carved into stone and pressed into clay. Once memory was freed from the fragile limits of the human mind, the course of humanity changed forever. Knowledge could now be stored, expanded, and shared across generations with precision. This accumulation of memory allowed something entirely new to emerge. Villages became towns, towns swelled into cities, cities wove themselves into networks of trade and authority. Civilizations began to rise, vast and intricate, powered not by any single mind, but by thousands working together. The first cities appeared in Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. Along the Tigris and Euphrates, fertile soils nourished crops that fed growing populations. People built walls and temples, not just to shelter themselves, but to symbolize their place in the cosmos. In Sumer, Uruk became one of the earliest true cities, with tens of thousands of people living together, their lives tied to trade, writing, and the rule of kings. Streets filled with potters and merchants, scribes and soldiers, all playing roles in a system larger than any individual could grasp. Elsewhere, similar patterns unfolded. Along the Nile, Egyptian civilization rose, nourished by the yearly floods that left behind rich soil. There, pharaohs commanded armies and laborers, raising pyramids that still touch the sky today. In the Indus Valley, carefully planned cities like Mohenjo-Daro spread with streets laid out in grids, wells and drainage channels, revealing sophisticated organization. In China, dynasties rose with powerful rulers, rituals, and philosophies that bound millions of lives together. Civilizations were no longer isolated experiments. They were multiplying across the earth, each shaping the destiny of humanity in different ways. Trade became the lifeblood of these new centers. Farmers grew surpluses that could be exchanged for goods from distant lands. Clay tablets record merchants traveling with caravans loaded with metals, spices, cloth, and livestock. Rivers carried boats heavy with grain, timber, and pottery. Seas linked cultures that had never before known of one another's existence. With trade came not only goods, but ideas, technologies, stories, and beliefs, moving from place to place, weaving a web of connection across continents. Empires emerged from these connections and conflicts. Some rose through conquest, swallowing smaller groups into larger realms. Others rose through alliances and trade, binding diverse peoples under shared systems of law and belief. Empires required organization on a scale never attempted before. Armies had to be supplied, roads had to be built, taxes had to be collected. Writing, once used only for tallying grain, became a tool of governance, recording laws, decrees, and histories that justified power. Kings and emperors claimed divine right, presenting themselves as chosen by gods or fate to rule. And millions of lives bent beneath these claims, shaping entire landscapes in the service of rulers whose names are still remembered thousands of years later. The emotional weight of this transformation is staggering. Imagine standing in a bustling ancient city, the air thick with the sounds of hammers striking metal, of animals bleating in markets, of merchants calling out their wares. Smoke rises from kilns and cooking fires. Children run between clay houses, while soldiers march in rows. Above it all, a temple towers, its steps rising toward the heavens, each stone placed by countless hands. No single person could create such a world. It was only possible because thousands worked together, their collective intelligence compounding into something greater than the sum of its parts. Civilizations scaled the human mind. Alone, a person could dream, imagine, and build. But together, thousands could create irrigation systems stretching for miles, calendars to track the stars, ships capable of crossing seas, and armies that reshaped entire regions. The human mind was no longer limited by the skull that contained it. Minds were now connected, through speech, writing, and trade, into a network that could solve problems and create wonders that no individual could achieve alone. Yet, beneath the grandeur of cities and empires, lay the quiet truth of human hands and hearts. Every stone in a pyramid was lifted by laborers who sweated under the sunday. Every clay tablet was etched by a scribe who leaned close in the dim light. Every road was carved from the earth by countless feet. Civilizations were vast, but they were made from the lives of ordinary people whose names are lost, but whose efforts built the world we live in today. And from these rising civilizations, humanity would turn not only to building and ruling, but also to questioning. As cities grew, so too did philosophy, religion, and science. Minds began to ask not only how to survive, but why we exist at all. The rise of civilization had scaled our intelligence, and now it was beginning to turn inward as well as outward. The rise of civilizations brought dazzling achievements, cities that touched the sky, roads that stretched for miles, laws carved into stone, and trade networks that tied continents together. Yet, woven into these triumphs was a darker thread, one that has followed humanity from its earliest empires to the present day. For every monument raised, there were lives bent under its weight. For every city that flourished, another fell in ruins. Greatness was always balanced with destruction. The first great cities thrived not only through cooperation, but through conquest. Armies marched across deserts and plains, their spears gleaming in the sunlight. When one city grew too powerful, it looked to its neighbors not as allies, but as resources to be claimed. War became a constant companion to civilization, shaping borders, toppling rulers, and scattering peoples. Victory brought spoils, land, and glory to the few, but death and devastation to the many. For those who stood in the path of an army, progress often meant ruin. Slavery, too, became embedded in the fabric of early civilizations. To build towering temples, vast palaces, and colossal monuments required labor beyond what free citizens could give. Conquered peoples were forced into servitude, their lives consumed in the service of rulers whose names still echo through history. The pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the great walls and palaces of empires, each was raised on the backs of thousands who had no choice but to obey. For the privileged, civilization shone as progress. For the enslaved, it was a cage. And civilizations did not only rise, they also fell. The very complexity that allowed them to flourish made them fragile. A drought could wither crops and starve cities. An invasion could topple dynasties that had ruled for centuries. Trade routes that once carried abundance could collapse, leaving famine and poverty in their wake. Archaeologists uncover ruins where bustling markets once thrived, silent streets where children once played, collapsed walls overtaken by roots and soil. Each fallen civilization is a reminder that human achievements, no matter how grand, are always vulnerable to the forces of nature and time. The cost of progress was not only written in human suffering, but also carved into the environment itself. Forests were cut down to fuel fires and build ships. Rivers were diverted to irrigate fields, sometimes draining them until the soil turned to dust. Animals were hunted to extinction as populations swelled and demands grew. Entire landscapes were reshaped to feed cities and armies, leaving scars that can still be seen today. Where once there had been abundance, overuse left deserts and empty plains. The earth itself bore the burden of human ambition. The emotional paradox of this era is haunting. Imagine standing before the towering walls of an ancient city, marveling at its scale, its carvings, its gleaming temples. You cannot help but feel awe at what humans accomplished together. Yet beneath the beauty lies silence, the silence of countless voices never recorded: the farmers who toiled endlessly in the fields, the slaves who carried stones until their bodies broke, the soldiers who marched into battles they did not choose. Civilization was magnificent, but it was never gentle. Even in its moments of collapse, humanity pressed forward. When one city fell, another rose elsewhere. When an empire crumbled, its knowledge was carried on in fragment scripts, copied by scribes, tools traded across borders, stories whispered into the ears of children. Progress never stopped, but it never came without cost. Every step forward was balanced by shadows, every triumph weighed down by suffering. And still, through all of this, humans continued to search for meaning. War and slavery scarred the world, but so did philosophy, religion, and thought attempt to heal it. The same hands that raised weapons also carved poetry into clay. The same voices that commanded conquest also asked questions about justice, morality, and the purpose of existence. Civilization's shadows grew long, but they existed alongside its light. From the ruins of fallen empires, from the suffering written into every monument, humans turned to deeper reflection. If we could build cities and topple them, If we could enslave and destroy as easily as we could create, then surely there must be more to our story. Soon, minds would begin to turn inward, searching not just for survival or power, but for understanding. The age of thought was dawning, carrying with it questions that would echo as loudly as the battles and monuments of the past. Amid the rise and fall of civilizations, amid the echoes of wars and the scars left on the earth, something new began to stir within the human mind. Once, our ancestors had struggled only for food, fire, and shelter. Later, they built villages, cities, and empires. But as life grew more complex, as monuments rose and fell, and as suffering walked hand in hand with progress, people began to ask deeper questions, not just how to survive, but why we are here at all. This was the dawning of the age of thought. Philosophy took its first breaths in places like ancient Greece, India, and China, though its roots reached much further back into the whispered wisdom of elders around firesides. Thinkers began to look beyond the daily tasks of farming and trade, and turned inward, wondering about the meaning of life, justice, beauty, and truth. In Greece, philosophers like Socrates and Plato asked what it meant to live a good life, whether knowledge was more important than wealth, and whether reality itself could be trusted. In India, teachers of the Vedic tradition and later Buddhists explored questions of suffering, rebirth, and how to achieve liberation. In China, Confucius taught about duty, order, and harmony, while Laozi spoke of the mysterious flow of the Tao, the way of nature itself. Religion also flourished in this age, giving people not only answers but comfort. Where philosophy asked questions, religion offered meaning woven into stories of gods, spirits, and the unseen. Temples rose in Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia, while shrines dotted the mountains and rivers of Asia. In every corner of the world, people sought to connect themselves to forces greater than their own lives. Belief-bound communities together gave shape to rituals and promised that even in the face of suffering and death, life had purpose. For countless generations, these beliefs guided how humans lived, governed, and dreamed. But thought did not stop with philosophy and religion. Science, in its earliest forms, began to emerge as well. Observers of the heavens mapped the stars, creating calendars that predicted the floods of the Nile or the changes of the seasons. Healers studied plants and the human body, testing remedies, recording which herbs cured fevers or eased pain. Engineers devised new ways to move water, to build bridges, and to raise buildings taller than ever before. Curiosity, once driven only by survival, now sought to understand the hidden patterns of the world. The emotional power of this moment in our story is profound. For the first time, the human mind was stretching in two directions at once, outward toward the stars, the earth, and the mysteries of nature, and inward toward the soul, the heart, and the meaning of existence. Questions once whispered in caves now echoed across cities. Who are we? Why are we here? What is the nature of reality itself? These questions carried humanity beyond survival and into reflection, shaping cultures as deeply as fire or farming ever had. Imagine a philosopher in Athens, pacing slowly beneath the open sky, debating whether the soul is eternal. Picture a monk in India, sitting quietly in meditation, seeking to still the noise of the world and glimpse a deeper truth. Picture an astronomer in Babylon, scratching symbols into clay as they chart the path of a wandering star. Across continents, minds that would never meet in person were asking the same timeless questions. Their answers differed, but their longing was the same, to find meaning in a life that often seemed fragile and fleeting. The age of thought did not erase suffering or inequality. Wars continued, empires rose and fell, and disease still haunted daily life. But within the turmoil, the seeds of philosophy, religion, and science planted something enduring. They gave humanity not only tools to shape the world, but also frameworks to understand it, to give shape to invisible fears, and to reach beyond the limits of the present. And as these ideas grew, so too did humanity's power to reshape the earth. Soon, the insights of thinkers, the rituals of religions, and the discoveries of early scientists would join with machines, industry, and inventions that magnified our reach. The age of thought was not the end of humanity's questioning. It was only the beginning of a deeper journey, one that would soon merge with iron, steam, and the restless hunger to master forces once left only to nature. The age of thought filled the human mind with questions and ideas. Philosophy asked about truth and morality. Religion offered meaning and belonging. Early science revealed patterns in the stars and cures in the plants of the earth. But thought alone was not the end of the story. Eventually, ideas turned into inventions, and inventions grew into machines that would change the face of the world forever. Humanity was about to enter the age of industry, a time when forces once belonging only to nature were placed in human hands. The Industrial Revolution began quietly, not with explosions or battles, but with the hum of new machines in workshops and the smoke curling from chimneys. At its heart was the harnessing of energy in a way no generation before had managed. For millions of years, humans had relied on muscle, fire, wind, and water. But now they tapped into coal buried beneath the earth and turned its heat into power. Steam engines, fueled by coal, began to drive pumps, spin wheels, and move iron pistons with a force far greater than human arms could ever provide. With steam came transformation. Trains roared across landscapes that once took weeks to cross on foot. Iron tracks cut through mountains and plains, connecting cities and villages, shrinking distances, and making the world feel smaller and more reachable. Steamships crossed oceans with a confidence that wind-powered sails could never promise. No longer were humans at the mercy of currents and breezes. They had begun to command the seas themselves. Steel followed, strong and resilient, a material that changed everything it touched. Bridges leapt across rivers, towers climbed toward the sky. Cities grew not only outward but upward, their skylines reshaped by the strength of steel beams. Where once wood and stone had limited ambition, steel unlocked possibilities that felt limitless. The world began to fill with structures that no ancient builder could have imagined. Vast factories humming with machines, railways that stretched for hundreds of miles, and ships larger than any wooden fleet before them. Coal was the beating heart of this revolution, dug from the ground in staggering amounts, burned to power engines, heat furnaces, and drive machines that wove cloth or smelted iron. The black dust of coal clung to miners, to towns, to the very air, a reminder of the new price of progress. For the first time in history, entire economies were fueled not by the rhythms of the sunlight or the turning of the seasons, but by the extraction of Earth's ancient reserves. The emotional pivot of this moment cannot be overstated. Imagine standing beside a massive steam engine as it hisses and churns, its pistons pounding with relentless rhythm. The heat, the sound, the sheer scale of power would have seemed almost supernatural to those who lived only a generation before. What once took dozens of people or the pull of animals could now be done by a machine that never tired. Humanity was learning to wield forces that once belonged only to rivers, winds, and firestorms. Nature was no longer the sole master of energy. Humans were beginning to command it. But alongside awe came disruption. Cities swelled with workers who crowded into factories, their days measured by the turning of gears and the ringing of whistles rather than the rising and setting of the sunlight. Smoke darkened skies, rivers filled with waste, and the cost of progress etched itself into both the bodies of laborers and the landscapes of nations. The power of machines lifted some to great wealth, while grinding others into hardship. Yet even through suffering, there was no turning back. Humanity had stepped into a new relationship with energy, with nature, and with itself. The Industrial Revolution did more than build machines. It built a new kind of humanity, one capable of reshaping the planet with speed and scale that no ancient farmer or hunter could have imagined. The world became a place of restless invention, of locomotives rushing across continents and factories spinning day and night, of steel bridges arching over waters that once divided people. And this ceaseless momentum carried us forward into an age where thought, machines, and communication would merge to connect billions of people together in ways no single mind had ever dreamed possible. The steam engine had carried us across continents. Steel had raised our cities into the sky. Coal and industry had given us power once reserved only for storms, rivers, and the sunlight itself. Yet even those forces, immense as they were, could not match the transformation that came next. The greatest leap of all was not made in fire or iron, but in thought itself. It was the leap into the digital age, where information became the new fuel and humanity wove itself into a single, restless web of connection. The first computers were enormous machines, their bodies filling entire rooms, their insides humming with vacuum tubes and endless wires. At first, they were used to calculate, to crack codes in war, to predict the trajectories of rockets, or to solve equations too vast for the human mind alone. They were not personal. They were distant, humming giants, tended by specialists. Yet even in those early days, something astonishing was happening. Humans were beginning to offload memory and logic into machines, creating companions of thought rather than muscle. Then came the shrinking of size and the expanding of reach. The transistor, and later the microchip, brought computers from vast laboratories into small offices, then into homes, then into pockets. Each generation of machines grew smaller, faster, and more powerful until they became inseparable from our daily lives. What once required a building to house could now fit in the palm of a hand, but the most profound shift came not from the computers themselves, but from their joining together. The internet linked machines into networks, and networks into webs, until the entire planet pulsed with invisible threads of communication. Suddenly, knowledge was no longer bound to libraries or distant experts. It flowed freely across continents in the blink of an eye. Ideas, stories, images, and voices leapt oceans as if they did not exist. For the first time in history, humanity became a networked species. Imagine standing in a quiet room, holding a small device in your hand. With a few touches of a screen, you can summon the wisdom of centuries, see the surface of Mars, hear the voice of someone thousands of miles away, or watch events unfold across the world in real time. The boundaries that once kept people separated, oceans, deserts, mountains, melt away in the glow of a screen. Billions of minds, once isolated by distance, are now connected, each one a flickering light in the global web of thought. This leap carries immense emotional weight. For the first time, a child in a remote village can learn the same knowledge as a child in a bustling city. Families divided by continents can see one another's faces in real time. Ideas that might once have died in silence can now ignite movements that reshape nations. The human story, once fragmented into countless local tales, has become one vast conversation. billions of voices rising, clashing, and blending together, shaping the future with each passing second. Yet the digital leap is not without its fragility. The same web that connects can also divide. Information flows, but so does misinformation. Connection grows, but so can isolation. Billions are linked, but not all equally. Some have access to the vast library of human knowledge, while others remain in silence, excluded by poverty or power. And even as we share more than ever before, our species remains vulnerable, our digital world resting on fragile machines, invisible codes, and networks that can be broken by storms, wars, or even a single keystroke. Still, the power of this moment is undeniable. For the first time, humanity has created something that resembles a global mind. Each of us is a neuron, a flicker of thought, and together we form something larger than ourselves, a vast and humming consciousness that spans the earth. It is imperfect, messy, and sometimes dangerous, yet it is also extraordinary. The journey from fragile apes, clinging to survival, to beings who can share ideas across the globe instantly, is almost impossible to fathom. The digital leap is the culmination of millions of years of adaptation, invention, and imagination. And even now, as we connect in ways no ancestor could have imagined, we remain as fragile as ever, our entire story still balanced on the edge of survival. From the first fragile steps of primates on shifting African soil, to the voices now carried through glowing screens across the globe, our story has stretched for 7 million years. It has been a journey shaped by fire, hunger, migration, invention, and imagination. Along the way, we were never alone. At least 20 different species of humans once walked the earth, each carrying its own hopes of survival. Neanderthals hunted mammoths in frozen valleys. Denisovans endured in caves high in the mountains. Other cousins, with names half-forgotten Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, Homo erectus, each left their footprints in the dust of time, and yet, of all of them, only we remain. We are the last surviving humans. Every other branch of our family tree has withered. Their bones rest in the earth, their tools lie buried in caves, their stories silenced by extinction. But they are not gone completely. They live within us. In the strands of our DNA are whispers of Neanderthals and Denisovans, gifts of immunity, strength, and resilience passed down from ancient encounters. The shape of our hands, the structure of our brains, even the way our bodies adapt to altitude or disease, these are not ours alone. They are inheritances, fragments of those who vanished, but who still move quietly within us. We are the carriers of their memory, their last breath lingering in every heartbeat we feel today. The emotional weight of this truth is profound. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast family gathering, yet realizing you are the last one left alive. The songs, the stories, the laughter of your kin are echoes now, their places empty, their chairs unfilled. That is humanity today. We are the only surviving branch of a once rich forest of human life. The responsibility of that survival is immense. For if the chain that stretches back 7 million years is to continue, it depends entirely on us. Every moment you are alive is proof of an unbroken chain. Each ancestor survived long enough to pass life forward through famine, storms, predators, and wars. At times, our numbers shrank to fewer than 10,000, a whisper of existence almost lost to the wind. Yet the chain never broke. It passed through firelight, where stories were told, through migrations across seas, through fields where seeds were sown, through cities built from stone and steel, and now through satellites and glowing devices that orbit above us. We are here because none of those links gave way. But the chain is fragile. 99% of every species that has ever lived is now extinct. Our cousins are gone. The mammoths are gone. The saber-toothed cats are gone. Survival has never been guaranteed, not for us, not for anyone. And though we have reshaped the earth, split the atom, and touched the moon, we remain as vulnerable as ever to the forces of time, chance, and our own choices. This is the emotional paradox of our existence. We are powerful, yet fragile. We are clever, yet uncertain. We are alone as the last humans, yet we carry within us the lives of all who came before. 7 million years of survival now rests in our hands. What we choose to do with it will shape not only our future, but whether the chain continues at all. The open question is one we cannot yet answer. Will we be the first to break the chain, letting it end with us, a final ember extinguished in the cold of the universe? Or will we be the first to carry it beyond the earth itself, planting our survival among the stars, ensuring that this fragile chain of life, stretched across 7 million years, continues into a future as vast as the cosmos? That answer has not yet been written. It waits for us. If you have made it this far, please give this video a gentle like and consider subscribing for more interesting stories like this. Thank you.